King James II ordered the building of this Anglican church in the 1680s because he was a king and a perk of his job is doing whatever they want. However, since Boston was full of Puritans who had come to the New World precisely to get away from the Anglicans, nobody was willing to sell land to the budding parish. In the end, the governor ordered that the church be built on top of the old public burial ground, the logic being that the dead couldn't complain. They're notoriously compliant, and there the church stands today. After the Revolution, the church was known as the Stone Chapel for several years. Kings not being particularly popular at the time, and calling a stone chapel the Stone Chapel was the best idea anyone could come up with at the time. I've never understood these people's needs for independence, by the way. We gave birth to them. They were happy to suckle on our teats in their infancy. There were a few toddler wobbles, but as soon as they got to their teenage years, all they could bang on about was their independence. So they stormed out, but we know they'll be back eventually to borrow money or to get us to wash their clothes, and we'll forgive them because we are older and wiser. Printing presses were originally brought to America to print religious texts, but by the time of the Revolutionary War, they were also used for things like newspapers, pamphlets, and broadsheets. I don't know what a broadsheet is. Think of it as the colonial internet, about the same speed as dial-up, unlike word of mouth. About the same speed as dial-up. Unlike word of mouth, newspaper articles could spread news for events from colony to colony quickly, without any loss of information. But that doesn't mean it wasn't unbiased. Far from it. Presses were commonly used to print propaganda. Every newspaper had its slant. Thank goodness that doesn't happen nowadays. Anyway, part of what made the Boston Massacre such a turning point were reprints of Paul Revere's Woodcut. It showed organized British soldiers in full formation firing point blank at an innocent crowd. A shocking image which enraged the people and fueled their hatred for the British. Completely made up, of course. But what did that matter? The public is there to be manipulated. Actually, I bet you could use these places to print some propaganda of your own. If the soldiers are getting too unfriendly, a little reminder that you're a hero of the people might help. I'm just gonna call it Zio. Because I can't, for the life of me, remember what the heck it's called. Zio was a member of the Indian nation, because you're not going to expect me to pronounce that. Something. Living on the frontier lands near Boston at the time of the French and Indian War. Assassin records indicate she was the daughter of the Ayakoaner, or clan mother, and from an early age she was groomed for leadership herself. While many in her community chose to ignore the incursions by colonists into the area and growing tensions between the French and the British, Zio was convinced that they presented a very real danger. She began to argue to anyone who would listen that the village should take action, rather than staying silent, which was contrary to the will of the clan chiefs at the time. She refused to follow their orders to remain neutral, deciding to fight back in her own way and recruiting help where she could get it, including from Hatham Kenway. Concord. This was the regulars' destination when they set out from Boston on the day of the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Inside the town, the British found cannon, flour, salt food, and musket balls. They broke the cannon and threw the rest into the local mill pond. A bad idea since the local residents retrieved most of it later, undamaged. In their zeal, the regulars also accidentally set fire to the local meeting house. It happens. And then joined the bucket brigade to help put it out. However, the local militia saw the smoke and thought the regulars had set fire to the whole town. The militia marched in, causing a battle with the regulars and the North Bridge, just outside the town. It was a comedy of errors with very little comedy. The battle at the North Bridge battle was immortalized in the Concord Hymn, a popular poem by Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson lived in Concord in the 1830s, which probably made him a bit biased. He refers to the fight at the bridge as the shot heard round the world. Bit of an overstatement, since the first shots of war had been fired at Lexington hours before. Maybe he'd been napping. You know what poets are like. Trading posts were essentially general stores set up in the North American frontier. The clientele, mainly explorers and members of local indigenous nations, would barter from various goods such as guns, axes, and pots and pans. Payment was mostly in the form of furs, which were shipped back to Europe. The fur trade at the time was extremely lucrative, and one of the reasons that explorers were continually moving into the frontier. They were hoping to find more and better sources of pelts. There was a reason Davy Crockett only ever seemed to have one hat. Many of the trading posts were privately owned, but they were used to push political agendas as well. For example, after the Revolutionary War ended, the British government used their trading posts to encourage the indigenous people not to sign treaties with the U.S. The U.S. government took over the colonial fur trade in the colonies in 1796, establishing something called the factory system. The idea was to regulate prices in order to stop exploitation of the indigenous peoples by private traders. Unfortunately, under the new system, indigenous leaders were forced to trade large amounts of land to get access to trading posts. Private exploitation had become government exploitation. Lucky that's the only time in history that's ever happened. Since that obviously wasn't any better, the factory system was abolished in 1822.